afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this special session on research methodology. I'm very glad you could make the time. My name is Brian MacArthur. It's my great privilege and pleasure to be the acting DVC for the college. And we're delighted that you could make it. We've got a lovely mix of academic staff members, students. We're all students, really, if you think about it, but students of research, and that's really who we're targeting. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Ben Daniel. I regard him as first a good friend and then an esteemed colleague. He comes from the University of Otago down in Dunedin. So he's traveled a fair distance to get here. And because he was in South Africa, we took the opportunity of inviting him here today. So Ben, thank you very much for making the time. We're looking forward to your presentation. He has, like me, a passion for research methodology. So we're strange people. Not too many people are passionate about research methodology. He's recently written a book where he captures many of his insights into research methodology, and is specifically geared to the higher education landscape. So look out for that book. He's a man who is very generous with his time and with his academic expertise, and that's what we're really, really grateful for today. So just a quick perhaps a scene setting of the topic. Many people say research is hard, and I think many would agree it's really hard. But there's certain aspects that are harder than others. People say the hardest part is the research question. You just battle with that for months and sometimes for years with the research question. Others say, no, it's the data analysis. That's the hard part. And often people think that the literature review is actually the easy part where you come along and you kind of read a few things and summarize them and then move on. And in fact, I think doing a good literature review is probably one of the hardest parts of research. And that's why we're so delighted that Ben will lead us through mainly academic literature reviewing, but also will listen to where your interests and questions lie. So we look forward to having your presentation, Ben. I know it'll be quite interactive, but we're delighted that you could join us here today. So thank you. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Brian, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. If I think of South Africa, now I'll think about one thing: flying for 35 hours. So that's pretty much how long it took me to get down here. But I'm pleased that I am here. And so what I'm going to do today and tomorrow, I'll be following up on this, is to share with you some of the work that we have done at the University of Otago. So I've been teaching research methodologies for a long time, over decades. And then only 6 years ago, I realized that there are a lot of challenges that actually I don't know why teaching research methodology is very difficult. So I started researching into some of the questions, and eventually we start putting together tools and techniques that perhaps will help students to engage with research methodologies better, to answer more critical questions, and also to help those who are teaching research methodologies to explain some of those abstract and complex questions. So, the topic of today is engaging with academic literature. Now, of course, to engage with academic literature requires certain ways in which you explore things, in which you synthesize things, in which you describe things, in which you critique things. 80% of our work as academics really involve engaging with some kind of literature. Whether you're reviewing papers, you're looking at data, you're listening to reports, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to share with you today are really broad issues around literature review, and also I'll provide you with some of the tools that we have used to help people engage effectively. Okay, so how many people are aware of, or how many people are familiar with the University of Otago? How many people don't know where University of Otago is? So normally, Normally what I do is that I present a very short video about our university, but because of time, I'll probably save that for another time. But the University of Otago is the oldest university in New Zealand. That means it's the first university in New Zealand. It has roughly 22,000 students. One of the biggest divisions there is Division of Health Sciences. So we have the biggest medical school, for instance. And the main campus is located in the southern island, which is Otago. And we also have satellite campuses in places like Christchurch, Wellington, and some administrative units in Auckland. Okay, so that's about the university. My department is the Higher Education Development Center. What that means is that we are 50% roughly service department and 50% traditional department. So what that means again is that we provide professional development to our colleagues. We also have PhD programs, master's, postgraduate diploma, and postgraduate certificate in higher education. Okay, so let's move on to literature. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word literature review? It's open. Or what does it mean, literature review?
Analyzing the existing body of knowledge.
Analyzing existing body of knowledge. Yes? That's the process of engaging with literature, and that's true. Anyone else with a different conception? Yes? Reviewing what others have said about your topic, and that's absolutely critical because you wanted to learn more about what previous research has said or has done.
Also be looking for areas where the research doesn't cover an aspect.
Absolutely. So looking at the literature in a very critical way to identify outstanding research questions. And quite often, our work as scientists or researchers, we need to produce new body of knowledge. And the only way to do that is to demonstrate that the current body of knowledge does not cover certain areas. So in other words, you need to identify critical questions or research gaps. Okay, now you see these are different ways of looking at the literature. So this process-oriented view of the literature, that is, what do you do actually if you wanted to engage with the literature? You read, you critique, and so on and so forth. But there's also outcome-oriented view of the literature. That is, why would you like to engage with that in the first place? What particular goals are you trying to achieve? Now, this is an important starting point when you're thinking about doing a literature review. Some individuals, that's how they describe what literature review is: to find out what others have done, to engage with the literature and relate what others have done to what you're trying to do. Or even things like keeping yourself relevant and up to date in your field. We academics read, right? We should be reading. And the idea is that we educate ourselves all the time. So we're all students, as colleague Prof. Brian has said, we're all students. It doesn't matter, it doesn't end. So what I'm trying to cover today, and this is not really going to, I'm not going to structure this as a workshop, but I'm hoping that I'll get some engagement, people asking questions to help us learn literature review more effectively. So one question that I ask usually is, how do we effectively and in a very systematic way engage with academic literature? process. Why is this important? Because quite often we get covered in the ocean of volumes of written work, and that becomes inefficient. I mean, if you're doing PhD, you have a very limited number of years to do that. If you're doing masters, even less. If you're an academic, you're writing a journal paper. Of course, you need to get that quickly. So you need to find some ways in which you can effectively engage with the literature. The second part is, once you've engaged yourself with the literature, how do you organize the output so that it makes sense? Are there better ways of presenting the literature review? If there are, what do they look like? The third part is, once you've done all these two, how would you know that what you've done is actually up to the quality required? Remember, we're talking about academic literature. So these three simple questions turn out to be more complex when you actually address them. But understanding how you actually navigate through these three questions can save you a lot of time in terms of doing the process itself, as well as coming up with a quality that you can justify whether it is up to the standards or not. Okay, so one purpose of doing literature review, as we already said, is to provide us with a big picture of what is going on. So you'll be reviewing 100 to 100 plus articles, and then you have 5 minutes to present the output. Tell us, what did you find in 5 minutes? And that quite often happens. If you can say in 5 minutes, you can summarize that work in 5 minutes, and then you know. So what we're looking for here is the big picture. What are the main research issues that your area is trying to, or people in the area are trying to address? Who are the main voices? What are the classical theories? What are the areas of disagreement? What are the areas of agreement? What kinds of methods are used in a discipline? All this could be part of engaging with the literature. So quite often, this stage is really you educating yourself. You're trying to learn about the key concepts, about the key theories, about the dominant voices, about the areas of controversies, about the methods, about the techniques, and so on. And part of that process is really to present yourself to others that you know what you're talking about. Quite often, PhD examiners look for that area. Quite often, peer reviewers look at the area of theory. So when you say theory, we're really talking about the literature. So the literature is an informal way of calling a body of knowledge theory. But theory could also refer to specific body of knowledge. Okay, so what does it entail? What does it really mean? Well, you highlight the past research, you look at what seems to make sense, what doesn't make sense, you try to group ideas together, you try to group theories together, you try to identify areas of controversies and so on. And then you need to critique. So these are really the 4 points that you need to do. Now, it turns out that some of these are more harder to do than others. Before I get into the details of this, let me just share with you a slide here. Quite often, new researchers, especially PhDs and people doing masters or postgraduate programs in general, believe that literature review is some kind of exercise that you do and then you complete, and that's chapter 2 or chapter something, and that's it. How many people share that view? Or how many people don't share that view? Why?
You still need to substantiate your work or your findings using the theory. Yes.
Good. So what if I say, someone wants to say something? Okay, so what if I say the role of literature review or the role of theory as such permeates through all the stages of the research structure. So what you see here is that the first part of engaging with the literature might be to clarify a research problem. So assuming that these different doors are actually rooms, if you have a house, you have 6 rooms, right? You'll find that certain rooms of the house, you spend a lot of time. Certain rooms, you go maybe once a week, and so on. So that's what the literature is when it comes to different stages or different phases of an academic output. We need the literature to clarify our research problem. We need the literature to justify why research is worth doing. In other words, you need the literature or demonstration of some understanding of the literature to say there's a research gap. If you're working in certain areas of research, you might look at the literature to clarify the aims of your research, that is, to clarify your research questions, to develop more useful research hypotheses. Quite often, you can have a valid research problem with a good research questions, but then you might struggle trying to see how you go about executing the research. You might go to the literature to look at what others have done in terms of research design. What kinds of statistical methods have they used? What kinds of data analysis framework have they used? What types of data visualization have they used? So you go to the literature only to look for that. And that's a very strategic move. Sometimes you consult the literature to look at what methods of data collection that you might apply in your own work. The most common one, and it's also the most misunderstood one, is discussion. Why do we do discussion? What is the purpose? In a book chapter, you get discussion. In an article, you get discussion. In a dissertation, you get discussion. What is discussion? Why should we do it? If you don't want to speak to me, speak to your neighbor. Just tell your neighbor, you have 1 minute. Yeah,
In discussing, you get the views from others.
yeah. You get the views from others, and then you compare whether those views from others, to what extent, mirrors your own views. So that's discussion. You're creating a dialogue. But why would you like to do that? Why do we do that as researchers? Have you ever questioned that? Should we be questioning that? We should be. So when you look at discussion in the context of literature, it's in fact an attempt to say what I have done can be related to what others have done. And that relationship is a kind of degree. To what extent are my conclusions supported by the literature, contradicts the literature, substantiate the literature? That kind of discussion is the most common one. And that kind of discussion is what I call a global discussion. Essentially, there are 2 types of discussion. The first one, however, before you do that, It's a discussion that happens within your own work, within your data set. When you do data analysis, essentially, you're looking at different data points and creating a discussion. And that discussion might be comparing similarities and differences, and then drawing conclusions. And it is that conclusion that you take and try to relate to the conclusions you've drawn from what others have done and create another dialogue. That way, you'll have a solid linkages between the problem justification, the gap, the scope of the gap in relation to the theory and your own work. So if you look at the literature that way, you'll see that literature is not one thing that you do and then that's it. Literature permeates throughout. It's like blood of a human being, right? It flows through any academic work. And that's what distinguishes academic work from other kinds of work. So 80%, 70 to 80% of any academic work has to do with literature. Maybe 10 or less percent of that is data. So the data or the evidence that you draw upon constitute 10 or less. The rest of the percentage is what you do with it and how you relate all this together. And literature is like a concrete foundation. Without it, what happens if you build a house with no foundation? Flooding comes, boom. Wind comes, boom. So if you have academic work that does not have solid theory or literature, and then of course, that piece of work can be open to questioning. I will promise that I will not talk all the time. So, if you can you have 2 minutes to share or to think, how would you normally approach and engage with the literature? What do you do? Do you have a way to do it? Do you have a systematic way of doing it? Or how do you do it? Or better yet, how would you teach someone how to do it? And that someone can be your student, that someone can be your colleague. Because as students, we also teach our colleagues. We share. Anyone wants to volunteer? Yeah?
From my own view, initially I try to identify keywords in my research work. That's either the problem or maybe my title. And then I have to identify the database, that's journal database, where I could find my research, journals that are related to my study. Then while I open each of those journals, I try to read the abstract to see if it is related to what I want to do, because the keywords might not necessarily give me some of the journals that are related to my work. And then I look at their conclusion also to see if their conclusion also have maybe solid ideas or things that I would use to justify in my own work or something. It's more of that. That's when I'm doing the literature search. That's when I'm looking for the papers. Then after putting the papers together, I do this grade where I list the titles and the areas in which I want to pick from those work. So at the time I'm reading, I'm able to identify what is it their methodology, or is it their analysis tool or something that I want to pick from that work, or maybe the actual gap that I have identified. Maybe I identified it from their work, so I would use that as the point for each of those journal work, so that when I start writing up my literature, I wouldn't have to go through all the literature database again. I would just have to look at what I want to attempt, and then I just go to the paper. Also, whenever I use my EndNote also to make notes, that's the EndNote software that I use, and then I attach those documents to each of the records that I have. So it's more of that, and then I just try to put together whatever I have and write up my literature.
Good. So you see, you certainly have a methodical way of engaging with the literature using different techniques, including tools such as EndNote. Someone else has a different way of attacking the literature? We're all students, so we share. Sharing is caring. All right, so let's move to the core topic of today. So as I said, it's very important to apply some method, a process-oriented method to engage with the literature. What you're trying to do is that you're trying to achieve efficiency. You have to be efficient. So that part is what I call a systematic way to engage with the literature. Now, systematic in the sense that you follow certain procedures, processes, and of course, with them, you have tools that help you to achieve what you're trying to achieve. The second part of this is called tripartite. It's a three components that work together in concert that provides you with more credible way of presenting the outcome of a literature review. So the model itself looks like that. I don't know how clear this is. We'll break it into two stages. So stage number one is called the screening and organizational stage. Here, as one of our fellows said there, that he looks at keywords. Now those keywords are quite often taken from the research problem. So in general, you frame a research or a research area to be reviewed, an area that you want to review. You develop explicit inclusion-exclusion criteria. Now, this exclusion or inclusion criteria will change as you review more. So that's a guide giving you structure so that you don't waste too much time reading everything, because there are a lot of things out there and you don't have time to do that. But by no means, you don't say this is the final definitive. Maybe it would be, depending on the area that you're interested in. Once you develop that, you engage now in the process of search. The first two areas here, maybe the first one or stage, the framing the research area is something that if you're a student, you probably need to work closely with your supervisor. And once that is developed, I recommend that you go to a subject librarian who will develop a search strategy for you. Quite often, something that you'll spend weeks, they will do it in 30 minutes because that's their area of expertise. So do consult your subject librarian to help you with more efficient way of coming up with a search strategy. Once you have the search strategy, one way to do this is to compile a list of abstracts. Now, bearing in mind that there are good papers that have bad written abstracts, there are good written abstracts that the paper is really, really bad. So that's when you learn how to read. Quite often when I tell my PhD students, I said, okay, we're going to spend some time, I'm going to teach you how to read. And they said, I know how to read. I said, yes, I know that, but I'm going to teach you how to read the academic literature. Because again, you're after efficiency. So once you read the abstracts, you validate the abstracts, and validation could be you share things with your supervisors. For supervisors, you can share with colleagues, or you share with yourself, right? And then, okay, these are the articles that I'm going to read. And then you engage in the process of reading. Now, of course, that process of reading differs from one individual to another. So some people scan through quickly. I will share what I do. I read the abstract, I look at the research questions, I go to the discussion, and then I go to the conclusion, and then I go back to theory, quickly like that. And then I decide whether I'm keeping this or throwing it out, or whether I need to read it in details or not. So when you do that quite often, you develop a way of efficiently reading fast. Now, quite often we believe that, or some people believe that whatever you read, everything that you read has to go to the literature. No. Remember, one key purpose of doing literature review is to educate yourself, because you want to learn what others have done. You might read one article, you can only have one sentence, because that's what you've learned from that article. Okay? So that gives you a general overview of that systematic part of the approach here, or systematic way of engaging with academic literature. Maybe I'll stop here and invite questions or comments.
I'm just wondering how you develop your exclusion criteria. Somehow it's easier to identify the inclusion criteria, and there's a kind of nervousness when you're doing the research to say, if I exclude it, I'm kind of going to miss something and an examiner will pounce on me. So exclusion criteria, maybe you can tell us a little about that.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a really, really important point, because quite often we wonder how much broader we need to read. Now, this differs from areas to areas. If you're working within computer science and engineering, quite often, because the field changes so fast, so you need to worry about time, right? So your inclusion criteria is more likely to be developed within time. But if you're working in the behavioral and social sciences, where things don't change that fast comparatively or compared to the other areas, and then you need to be worried about current debate. What is trendy? Because there are trendy things, right? And the other thing to be mindful is each and every discipline is different. So there are classical theories that you absolutely have to know, even if you're not going to include in your work, because chances are that you will be asked. But quite often, the immediate answer to help you develop exclusion and inclusion criteria is the scope of your study. So the research question, how broad is it? So if you scope it, that will give you some idea on how much you need to, what kinds of things you need to include, what kinds of things you need to throw. I don't know if that answers. So something around that. So it's important to know the nature of your discipline, what is considered acceptable practice, what is the norm, whether currency, is an issue or not. What are the trends, or what are trendy issues, and who are the people who are engaged in that. So it comes back to voices, key voices, or controversial questions, areas where there is a disagreement. Of course, keeping in mind that the inclusion-exclusion criteria can change as you read more. You can always, add things, or you can throw things. And that's the process of...
Sorry, I don't want to create a dialogue, but I just want to ask a follow-up.
Yeah.
I think some disciplines, in all disciplines, there will be some journals that you would want to have in your literature review, and perhaps others that you would dare not put into your literature review. So that might also be one of those criteria.
Absolutely. And this is really important, because these days you have all kinds of journals, and also differs from institution to institution. There are institutions that It doesn't matter, regardless of discipline, journal articles, high impact journal articles are the one that should be included. But within that, for instance, in my own discipline, I'll be looking at things like computers and education, the British Journal of Educational Technology, and all those big journals where the keynotes, my keynotes publishes in. And some of that will be, what is accepted, culturally accepted, or culture political accepted. And that's very critical, especially when you're writing a journal paper or when you're writing a PhD. Okay, so once you're comfortable with the process, once you are comfortable with the process, you compile the resources and you have read. Now you need to produce reports. The first part is what we call a systematic review descriptive. So essentially, you are describing what you have read. You are identifying dominant voices. You are identifying areas where people don't disagree. People disagree. People agree. You're also looking at methods and so on. So you describe what is going on. As simple as that. But as I said, you'll be spending 2 years doing that exercise. And then you have a panel who sit there and you have 10 minutes to sum it up. Now you have to choose what is more important, right? And that quite often revolves around the research question or the main area of review or the purpose of that review. Brian is, we are interested into looking into pedagogy of research methodologies, right? What kind of research is produced within this area for the last 10 years? Why do I have 10 years? Because quite often, it is becoming common that a range of technologies are being used to teach research methods. So the pedagogy itself changes. And those technologies, most of them have been introduced in the last 10 years, especially with the use of social media and other tools that people engage with those tools to produce different research different areas. Now, if you ask me to summarize in 5 minutes, I will tell you what is happening. Maybe in 1 minute, right? That is little on the area. And the reason is because research methodology is one of those areas that is everybody's problem, but nobody's problem. Everybody knows it's important. Everybody thinks someone should do it, but nobody does it, right? So there's quite different ranges of work that have been done there. So one of the objectives of doing this kind of work is to raise the profile, the culture of teaching research methods. The second part is that you don't only describe what is going on. You need to say what are the different trends, what are the different voices, what are the different theories in that area, what are the different concepts. In other words, you need to synthesize the research. So you describe, you synthesize. Yes?
I just want to ask about, you were talking about doing research in research methodology area.
Pedagogy.
Yeah, pedagogy and things like that. So from experience, I'm usually told that you don't cite, if you're writing your research methodology chapter, you don't cite publications that are in area of research methodology. You have to use textbooks. You have to use textbooks, or you have to use mostly textbooks, because they feel that's where the main seminar work or this thing is being done. But if you're using research, if you're using journal papers, I really don't know what the justification was, but my supervisor and some other people that I know always frown against using using citing journal papers when you are writing your methodology chapter. So I don't know, from your own view, what do you think?
Well, from my own view, I think the first thing that I need to say is that supervisors are always right. And that covers many things. But I'll also I want to say that the different conception of that, and perhaps why that person said that is based on the fact that a lot of work in methodology are textbooks. So we have very few journals that are dedicated to publishing articles. And there are very few researchers that I can count them actually in every country well, I shouldn't say every country, but most countries who are actually solely researching into research methodologies. Because, and one of the problems is that research methodology is viewed upon as a means to an end. So people use it when they want to achieve something. But for someone like me and Brian, we actually said, we need to come up with new ways of looking things. Why are we only using interviews? There should be a new way of collecting data when you're doing qualitative research, right? So depending on the individuals, textbooks are the dominant sources of information, but there are much more resources than textbooks. So I don't know if I answered that question, but whatever it is, if you're a postgraduate student, I stand by my first statement, because quite often supervisors know the examiners. They are the examiners, and they are representing the examiners. So chances are that what they say is actually a reflection of the examiners within your area. And perhaps it's less of importance which source, as long as they're all credible, I think should be fine. And also, of course, depending on the purpose of the citation. When I teach research methods, I don't use one source. And actually, I encourage my students to read all different sources, but I don't ask them to use one particular source, because I draw my ideas from different sources. So research methodology is applied, but also theoretical discipline. And that's why there are very few degrees in the world that offers degree in research methodology. There are universities that do masters in research methodology and PhDs, but very few that do undergraduate. And that's the reason. The area is highly multidisciplinary. It is still young. Now I'm talking about research methodology, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. And now what? What is the fourth tradition? First tradition, quantitative. Second tradition, qualitative. Third tradition, mixed methods. What is the fourth one? Data science. That's the fourth methodological tradition. And that draws upon the three other traditions. So I don't know if I answer your question, but that's the way sometimes it is. Okay, so description and synthesis. Have to be mindful of time now. The third part of the tripartite model is critique. And that's the most difficult one. If you're able to tell me what is going on, and you're able to tell me the different ways in which whatever you're telling me is going on, and then you might be able to tell me what you think should happen next or shouldn't happen in the first place. And that's critique. And quite often, the ability to critique the theory or ability to critique the literature is ability to move beyond what others have done, to think what outstanding research questions need to be answered. What are the kinds of limitations in the area. And that requires more thorough understanding of the different areas and how they all come together or where there's areas of disagreement. Okay, so you go from description, synthesis, and critique. Any comment?
My comment is about the critique that you made mention of now. More often, if you are doing research, we do research around areas in which maybe you do not really know much about it. You want to get more information. So it's quite difficult for you to critique what you do not know. So is you if you kind of say comparing or trying to put together what people have said, either the negative and positive and things like that, is that critiquing? So what I mean is saying, if this person said that this they agree to what, and then another person said because of their own situation or their own case, they do not agree with such. Is that also critiquing, or how do you, or in what position do you critique the literature?
Good question, and very common question. So the first comment that I would like to share is that to critique is not to dismiss. When academic critiques something, they want to improve it. So that's the first mindset of being critical. If you're not able to suggest something, and then you actually don't have the ability to critique. And so critiquing academic work can happen in different ways. You could critique the logic of an argument. You can critique the structure of argument. You can critique the relevance of argument. You can critique based on time. Research done 50 years ago, maybe things have changed now. It doesn't hold anymore. Why should we still hold into theories that don't explain the social, economic, technological environment of the 21st century? So if you look at theories, how many people in management science here? Economics, sociology, right? How many theories are there that are developed in the 19th century don't work anymore? So that's you enhance. So the way they develop those theories is to critique, to say, well, this situation does not, or these kinds of tools can no longer help us address this current situation. Journalism, that's an area that has changed, right? So journalists now use social media to harvest stories and put them together to inform. Previously, they do interviews, right? So interview is one method of collecting data, but now there are different ways. So that itself could be another form of critique. But I'll show you some particular areas where you could start thinking about when you want to critique a piece of work. Before I do that, anyone else has some comments? Yes? Did I see a hand? I saw a hand and then it disappeared. Maybe just saying things that are not there. Right, okay. So this is some kind of exercise that you can use on your own, you can use in groups. Just do a kind of housekeeping to see whether you have actually achieved some of the things that you're trying to do when you engage with the literature. You ask yourself, do you actually know what previous research has been done in the area? Can you say that? What have you learned from reviewing the literature? Can you say that 5 minutes talk on the main summary of what is going on? Can you identify dominant theories, dominant ideas within the literature? Can you synthesize? Can you compare and contrast theories? Can you look at assumptions of theories? By the way, somehow we'll make the slides available, so you don't have to take pictures. And of course, the recording is there. So, and then the last point is, what are your own views? if you tell the story as it is, that means you don't have your own views, right? Right? When I say right, there's an echo, right? And so if you do that, you're actually doing what I'm doing. Because the echo, you become an echo instead of a voice. You have to have your own voice. You don't need to be an echo. You don't need to replicate what others have said, because then you're not adding any new perspective. You're not able to critique. You're not able to bring new insights. Okay, so the first part, or the first tool that we use to develop the tripartite components is really a simple table like this. Now, I'll encourage you to go and try this on your own. And I'll just encourage you to try with 3 articles. Okay? So, assuming that the first column here, these are the traditional or the usual things that you see in an article. These research questions in an article, the methods, theory or literature, the conclusions, limitations. Perhaps not the last one. Try to read one article and look at the aims and objectives and put it on the first cell here, and then second and third. And then ask yourself a question. These 3 articles that you have reviewed, what are the similarities and differences in the objectives? So you take that row there, transpose it, and then summarize that. You might also look at methods and do the same. So once you're able to do that, if someone said, okay, the 3 articles you read, have they all used the same methods or different methods? What are the similarities and differences? And you could just talk about methods applied in your area. Researchers, what kinds of methods they do. We know that some disciplines open up more into qualitative versus quantitative. Some disciplines are all mixed. The most important one is perhaps the last one. So what then? When you have read an article, well-written article, suppose, what have you learned from that article? What do you take away? And that so what is very important, because that is the beginning of your understanding of how to improve the work, how to critique the article. Or if you wanted to know 5 minutes, what does the research say in your area based on those 3 articles? You look at the conclusions, the different conclusions, look at them, summarize, and say, in general, researchers have agreed that. However, they also disagree. So you look at the conclusions and draw those ideas. If you have done 3, add 10, add 20, and so on. And then you have a huge data that now you can sit down after doing all the exercise and write it up. And that's how you start looking at different ways of presenting your work. Okay, so writing literature review is personal. Some people talk too much, like myself. Some people don't talk at all, they talk little, right? Like you, right? And so it's important to know your own personal identity when it comes to writing these things. But in certain areas, you're required to elaborate more, especially if you're working in the social and behavioral sciences. You have to engage more with theory, because there's no one way of doing things. There are many ways of doing things, and quite often people argue. But in some sciences, we have universal laws, the laws of gravity. If you want to change that, you have to come with a new research, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that although there are different ways of presenting a credible literature, they are almost ways that you can know where or what level of abstraction this person is writing from. And I'll share with you two. You might be writing the literature reporting based on author or subject. So that's what we call author-centric presentation of the literature report. But a good literature review reporting should go beyond the author to ideas. For example, let's take this example here, and this is not a true story. I made this up, but this is to demonstrate how you can move from author-centric to idea-centric. So this is on global warming, right? And it's narrative in nature. So author X conducted an observational study and concluded that global warming is caused predominantly by human activities, right? Someone did study and showed that we are responsible for the problems in the planet. Another author said yes. So author Y confirms this view. However, they explicitly identified some activities that not only human, but when human does this and that, deforestation and overfishing, as additional factors causing environmental degradation. Now, this goes on building on authors, different authors around those studies into now domain specific. So going from author to human geography and environmental sciences have linked. So it's not only any author in any study, but you're now breaking into domains. And then from that, you can break into theories. So if you have a study or literature review report that describe author Y said that, author X said that, that's when people accuse you of presenting laundry list, right? Have you heard that word? Because you're describing this said that said that, that said that, and then someone said, yeah, so what, right? What's your point? So you need to think about how to structure the report so that it's not only focused on individuals, but also focus on ideas. You're moving away from specific studies to ideas. And what link those ideas together are perhaps some of the research questions or the methods or sample size or statistical techniques. So you have to be creative in doing that.